This morning's plenary speaker is Professor Adele Goldberg of Princeton University. Now, when Mark and I were originally talking about the possibility of hosting this conference, Mark was trying to convince me that it would be good for my career, good for my professional development. And he said something to the effect that Adele's involvement with CSDl, co-organizing and then later publishing the volume, may well have been what got her tenure. And I thought, great. If only it were that easy, There would be a lot more competition to host this conference, I think, if that were all that were required. But I think it's pretty clear that Professor Goldberg got tenure, first of all, because of her incredibly influential book, Constructions, and second, because of her amazing scholarly output since then. Many very productive researchers have, maybe a 2007A and a 2007B on their CVs. But Professor Goldberg's go down to G and H in some years. So she's concerned very globally with the basic question of compositionality or lack thereof in language and creativity and generalization in language, and she'll be speaking on this topic today. So please welcome Adele Goldberg.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I've enjoyed this conference tremendously. I think every year CSDl has gotten better and better. It's very nice to be back to Ohio. I was actually born here. And it's very nice to be back to CSDL. I think it was Ron and Gilles and I who organized the very first one and gave it that horrible acronym. But really, the talks have been terrific, and everything has been really enjoyable. So thanks for getting up so early in the morning after such a big feast last night. Okay, what I'll talk about today is the existence of both items and generalizations in language. Biologists once pointed out that there's always a tension between being a lumper and being a splitter. So splitters, he said, see very small, highly differentiated units. Their critics say that if they can tell two animals apart, they place them in different genera. And if they cannot tell them apart, they place them in different species. Lumpers, on the other hand, see only large units. Their critics say that if a carnivore is neither a dog nor a bear, they call it a cat. The nice thing about a constructionist usage-based approach is that it gives you a way out of this lumper-splitter dilemma. It lets you have your cake and eat it too. You have the items and you have the generalizations. So this is what Ron emphasized in his 88 paper, a usage-based approach. The idea is that we retain an impressive amount of item-specific knowledge, and we also categorize or generalize the input we hear into patterns based on both form and function. The constructionist side of it argues that your knowledge of grammar consists of learned pairings of form and function at varying levels of generality. So words are clearly constructions because they're learned pairings of form with function. Partially filled words, aka morphemes, are also constructions. We have filled idioms, they're constructions, going great guns. Partially filled idioms are also constructions, so you can jog his memory or her memory or their memory. Even less filled idioms or constructions are, again, learned pairings of form with function, so the X or the Y. Even very frequent idioms, which aren't usually called idioms because they're so frequent, but they're learned pairings of form with function, like the passive construction. And finally, there doesn't need to be any specific morphology involved. So we have the ditransitive construction, for example. So I want to emphasize today how grammar's full of both regularities and idiosyncrasies. So before I get into the data I'm going to focus on, I just want to give you a couple examples of both. So when you're looking at argument structure constructions, which is my primary love, you see lots of generalizations. So if you look at the abstract form, it's paired with a very general meaning, independently of the verbs that occur in it. You get a family of related meanings, of course, depending on the verb, but there's clearly a prototypical meaning for each of these basic sentence patterns. So the ditransitive, again, prototypically, it occurs with give, she gave him something, but you can also use it with a new verb like fax. I guess that isn't so new anymore, but she mooped him something, and you still get the interpretation of transfer. The intransitive motion, like she went down the street, but you can also say she whooshed down the street. Or the cause motion, she put the ball in the box, or she sneezed the foam off the cappuccino. Or finally, the resultative, he made her crazy, but you can also say he kissed her unconscious, or she kissed him unconscious. There are also constructions that are incredibly idiosyncratic. So I'm working on one with a grad student from Berkeley now, Sarah Burson, that involves many a night, or many a day, or many an hour, and then subject auxiliary inversion. So you're inverting the subject and auxiliary. Okay, so think of a sentence that starts with many a night. Okay, what follows that? Go ahead, shout it out. Many a night, subject auxiliary inversion. Many a night what?
Have we.
Okay, have we or have I, is that what? Okay, good. So here's an attested example. Many a night have I wept into a salad bowl full of frosted flakes. So the form is clearly quirky. Notice that you have this plural determiner many appearing with a singular determiner It's a completely weird form, followed by subject auxiliary inversion, which is weird in its own right. And the function of this construction turns out to be very specific. So it can be described as involving a subjective stance toward broadly construed non-future events. So I realize that's a mouthful. But to show you what I mean, if you do a corpus search for many a night, it turns out that 99% of them involve first-person subjects. So you say, many a night have I, or many a night have we. You don't say, many a night has he done something. You also don't get future auxiliaries. So you don't say, many a night will I. So that's what I mean by saying it's a subjective stance. It's a first-person presentation toward some non-future events. Now, so to learn this construction, you have to learn these statistical constraints on what kinds of pronouns can go in it, what kinds of auxiliaries can go in it. It's very peculiar. Okay, so I'm going to focus on a slightly different case, but this is just sort of to whet your appetite for what the adult competence looks like. It can be very general and productive, but it can also be very idiosyncratic and constrained. So we're going to look at our item-based knowledge, and also we're going to see subtle generalizations being created. Okay, so what I'm going to focus on is a certain class of adjectives. Now, if you ask what adjectives are, people will normally rattle off a few standard tests for adjectivehood. So in English, adjectives modify nouns semantically. Adjectives are the things that can appear after the verb seem. So you can say he seemed tired, he seemed happy, but you wouldn't say he seemed in California. And they can also occur before nouns. And of course, that's true of prototypical adjectives like red and big and tall. But the cases I want to focus on are these other cases, like the adrift boat or the awake man. Notice they're slightly odd when used before nouns. So it's a little odd to say the adrift boat or the awake man. Okay, now the judgments are somewhat subtle, and I know there are non-native speakers here. So, but the claim is that this whole set of adjectives is odd before nouns. So it's odd to say the asleep child, the afloat ship, the alive monster, and so on. The evidence for the judgments, well, the first piece of evidence comes from a little corpus study just using Google, where I did searches for either the asleep, and then I chose a noun for each of these adjectives, and I chose a noun that was non-collocational with the adjective. So I looked for the asleep child and an asleep child, added those together. Those are represented in the first column. And I compared that with the number of hits I got for child was asleep. So I picked a particular verb there. But the question was, how likely is it for these adjectives to appear in attributive or prenominal use versus predicative, postverbal use? And you can see it's very skewed. These adjectives really disprefer prenominal position. Okay, and I'll give you something to compare these numbers to in a second. Now, you might wonder, well, okay, but maybe it's just a general fact about the grammar. Maybe it's a general fact about the semantics. So is it a semantic dispreference? Others have noticed that when you have a very stable property, it's happy in prenominal position, like the shy child, Whereas temporary properties are a little bit happier in predicative position, probably for the simple reason that in predicative position you get to apply tense. So you can say the child was shy. The difference to notice is that if you say the shy child in a non-contrastive situation, you probably mean that the child is generally shy. But if you say the child was shy, you could say the child was shy at the birthday party. Might be a very gregarious child, but the child was shy at this moment. Okay, and notice that the A adjectives do tend to be temporary properties. So asleep, afloat, aghast, abashed, ablaze, afraid. We don't like to think of alive as a temporary property, but it is also a temporary property. Okay, so, sorry, it's not registering. Okay. So in order to see if the dispreference is due to a general semantic dispreference, we can compare the A adjectives with the unstressed schwa at the beginning to near synonyms. So instead of asleep, we'll look at sleepy, or instead of afloat, we'll look at floating. Instead of alive, we'll look at living, and do the same corpus search for these adjectives. These, you can see, show no dispreference for being used before nouns, attributively. So 53% of the time, they occur before nouns. So it doesn't seem to be a general semantic dispreference. And when you do the statistics, it's very clear that there's a difference in the distribution between the A adjectives and the semantically parallel non-A adjectives. Okay. Another possibility is that it's just a general phonological dispreference. So these A adjectives have this unstressed schwa at the beginning, and maybe if you put a determiner before them, that's also unstressed, or maybe it's because you have two stressed syllables in a row. Maybe it's a phonological dispreference. But we can check on that too by finding other adjectives that have the same stress pattern as A adjectives. So we looked at extinct, maligned, inane, impaled, upset, immense, petite, all of the same unstressed, stressed, lexical stress pattern. And you can see that they too show no dispreference for being used prenominally. Right, 77% of the time, they're used before nouns. And the distribution between these phonologically parallel adjectives and the A adjectives is clearly distinct again. Okay, so remember, this is the distribution that we want some account of. This is the asleep, afloat, alive class. Okay, and what we can say, if it's not due to phonology and it's not due to semantics, is that it doesn't seem to be due to some general rule-like generalization. So one question that comes up is, how do kids learn this restriction? So how do they learn not to say the afraid man? It's clear that their parents don't tell them, please don't say the afraid man, say the man is afraid. Right? No one gets evidence like that. And more generally, we don't get explicit negative evidence. So, if a child says, me loves you, mommy, most mothers, we hope, is not going to correct the child. The parent's going to give the kid a hug. And conversely, if the child produces a beautiful grammatical sentence like, I have just completed a colorful mural on my bedroom wall with indelible markers, the child's not likely to get positive feedback. But one solution to this lack of direct negative evidence is, of course, the existence of indirect negative evidence, specifically in the form of preemption. So if we think about the causative alternation, how does a child learn not to say, she disappeared it? Well, if the child expects he disappeared the bird in that is in a context where there's direct causation, say where a magician makes the bird disappear. If instead the child hears he made the bird disappear, the child could learn upon several exposures that the latter is the conventional way to express that idea. So in the cases we're interested in, if a child expects the afraid man but systematically hears the man who was afraid, then they could learn to avoid the first phrase. Notice there's nothing really surprising about statistical preemption. We're familiar with it from morphology. This is, of course, how we have to learn not to say goad. You hear went in a context where you would have expected to hear goad, again and again and again, and eventually you learn that went is the right way to express that idea in that context. You notice it works productively, so you can ref a game, but you wouldn't say that someone's a refer because we already have a word for that idea. We have referee. Okay. And there's, in fact, some previous evidence that the statistical preemption does have an effect. So in Brooks and Tomasello's article from '99, they had children in two conditions. So in one condition, the kids heard both an intransitive use of this novel verb cham and also a paraphrastic causative. This is the preemptive context. So he made it cham. In the second condition, they only got the intransitive use of cham, and cham was acted out. It was the object bumped or something, the object fell or something like that. And then at the test part of the experiment, the experimenters asked the children what happened to the cow. So now they're pulling for a transitive use. And what they found was that the first condition that heard the preemptive context was half as likely to produce the transitive because, again, it was preempted by this paraphrastic causative. Okay, so hearing the novel verb used in the paraphrastic causative provided a readily available alternative to the transitive construction. Okay, so we'll come back to that idea, but to summarize, the reason you don't say the afraid boy is probably because it was statistically preempted by the boy was afraid, and possibly in this case also the scared boy, which has a very similar meaning. Okay, we'll come back to this with the second experiment I'm going to describe in a few minutes. Okay, but if we want to explain the distribution, I think the only way to really explain it is to appeal to the diachronic history of the language. So it turns out that most of these adjectives were at one time prepositional phrases. So asleep was in sleep, a bloom was in bloom, adrift was on drift, and so on. Now notice that this is an explanation because when the adjectives were prepositional phrases, you wouldn't expect them to occur prenominally because we don't put prepositional phrases before nouns. So you can't say the on sleep child, you can't say the on drugs man. So the distribution is motivated by this diachronic history. Of course, people aren't aware of the diachronic history, so synchronically, in today's speakers' minds, it requires a usage-based model. It requires that speakers are aware of which adjectives they've heard in which constructions. Now, if I were a generative syntactician, I might want to suggest that adjectives are synchronically underlyingly prepositional phrases, right? That would be a move that they would be likely to take. But of course, this proposal would raise more questions than it answers. You'd have to explain then why you can't separate the from the root in these adjectives, right? So you can't say the man was extreme afraid to mean extremely afraid. You also can't conjoin these, so you can't say the man was afraid and sleep. Also, if they were in any sense still prepositional phrases, you'd expect that they could occur after the noun without special intonation. So you can say the man under the bed had escaped the police. So if it were, that's the way prepositional phrases act. But you can't say the man asleep had escaped the police. Now, it is true that you can say the man asleep on the floor had escaped the police. So if you make the adjective heavy and complex, you can have it appear after a noun. But you can do that with all adjectives. So the man short had escaped the police. You can't say that. But you can say the man short, even with his boots on, had escaped the police. So the fact is that these adjectives pattern like adjectives in other ways, except that they don't occur before nouns. Also, there's, of course, the question, how would learners know that these adjectives and only these adjectives are underlyingly prepositional phrases? Learners would have to notice that these adjectives and only these adjectives appear predicatively, that they avoid the prenominal use. But that's, of course, what we want to explain. So this kind of generative story doesn't do us any good. Okay. The constructionist usage-based view, though, says learners record statistics about particular items' distribution, and also constructional generalizations emerge from learners categorizing over the input, and it's the second point that I'm going to focus on now. So we might ask, do learners really need to record that each and every A adjective appears only predicatively? Well, maybe not, right? Because we do categorize or generalize on the basis of semantics, pragmatics, grammatical patterns, and phonology. And it turns out, and I think this is a wild fact, that afraid never was a prepositional phrase. So afraid was historically the past participle of affray, which was a verb meaning to startle. So the motivation for afraid doesn't come from the history of the word. Afraid got sucked into the category that was created by the other examples. So speakers have assimilated, aghast is the same, by the way, to the category of A adjectives. Now, some of you may have noticed that it's not all A adjectives. Have you been writing down exceptions? Okay. So there are exceptions to this exceptional pattern. Not all A adjectives resist pronominal use. See if you can think of one.
Agent.
What?
Agent.
Well, okay, that would have the wrong vowel sound, though. We need an unstressed schwa, right?
Adjacent.
Adept, okay. What? Adjacent, good, good, good. Yep. Right, another one is the absurd comment. So absurd is fine before nouns. Here's some exceptions. A lot of multisyllabic, more than 2 syllables, A adjectives are fine before nouns. So adjacent is one of those. But absurd, astute, adult, acute, aloof actually are okay before nouns. Interestingly, aloof did come from a prepositional phrase, so it got moved out of the pattern. Okay, now we really have a problem, right? How do we account for this, right? We have a category, afraid got sucked in, aloof got kicked out, some work, some don't. How do we know this? What do we do with these adjectives? Okay, I think there is a generalization here. We can circumscribe the pattern more narrowly as follows. Okay, so I think the generalization is that when the A adjectives are segmentable into an unstressed schwa plus a root, a recognizable root, then they resist prenominal use. So notice afloat is a plus float. Float is very easy to recognize. Alive, live is very easy to recognize. Aghast, marginal, ghastly. Abashed, we do use that word in bashful. Ablaze, clear, blaze. Afraid arguably is a root insofar as we say fraidy cat, and people also probably recognize its similarity to frighten. The ones that don't follow this pattern, that is the ones that work like all the other adjectives, are not segmentable. So clearly absurd, it's not segmentable into absurd, right? You couldn't segment it that way for phonotactic reasons. Astute is not a root, doesn't mean anything. In acute, cute means something, but it doesn't mean the right thing. And dult also is not a root. Okay, so that seems to separate the class that works and the class that doesn't. And notice that the historical facts motivate this generalization, right? The historical facts said that historically these used to be prepositions plus nouns. And so the generalization today is that it's the unstressed schwa plus a root. So people have generalized this category very intelligently to a very narrow class of items. So the generalization seems to be that the input statistics from the days when A adjectives were prepositional phrases have been perpetuated. Synchronically, speakers form a category of A adjectives on the basis of phonology and morphosyntax, and they assimilate new members to this category, new members like afraid. And this is exactly what you expect in some sense, on a usage-based model where we record a great deal of item-specific information and we generalize. I'm really struck by how intelligently we generalize, in this case, over it, meaning that it's not just anything that sounds the same, it's got to be a plus a recognizable root. Okay. So in work with my postdoc, Jeremy Boyd, we set out to see whether you could see the process of generalization at work. So we were intrigued by the afraid case. So in the first experiment, we had undergraduate speakers do a very simple production task. So we would give them two pictures of the same animal. We'd note that one was dead and one was alive, and we'd introduce them. Here are two foxes. And we'd simply, one of them would move to the star, and we'd ask them which fox moved to the star. And then we recorded how they responded. Did they say the alive fox moved to the star, or did they say the fox that was alive moved to the star? They were told to be clear about which of the two animals moved and to produce sentences that sounded natural. Okay. We also included nonsense adjectives. So now, here are two cows. Which one moved to the star? We remove it. Which one moved to the star? Okay. So we included 6 real adjectives: ablaze, afloat, afraid, aghast, alive, asleep. 6 semantically matching non-adjectives, so flaming, floating, frightened, shocked, living, and sleepy. And then 6 nonsense adjectives and 6 nonsense non-adjectives. Okay. Now, if you do a task like this and you just simply ask people to always do adjectives, they're going to fall into a pattern, right? Syntactic priming or simple perseveration, or they're going to always produce prenominal use or always produce relative clause use. We had to kick them off that pattern. So what we did was we introduced counterbalanced fillers that were designed to kick them off one pattern or the other. So when you get an adjective, everybody uses it prenominally. You don't say the cow that was good, you say the good cow. And if you use a present tense verb like bites, you can't say the bites cow, you have to say the cow that bites. So by introducing these, we introduced some variation, but we counterbalanced it so that half the time they saw a prototypical adjective before the noun, and half the time they saw a present tense verb before the target item, I meant to say. Okay? So the manipulations we were interested in was, again, the phonology, whether the adjective was an adjective or not, and whether the adjective was real or not. We wondered if that played a role. And what we coded for, again, was the proportion of cases that were used before nouns, the prenominal use, the attributive use. Again, we recorded what people said. If they didn't pronounce the adjectives right, we threw the data out, and there were a few subjects that did that. Okay. So here are the results. Again, the y-axis is the percentage of prenominal productions. For the real adjectives, these are the adjectives we started out with, afraid-like adjectives. You get a significant difference between afraid and what was it? Scary or something. So there's a statistical difference in how likely people are to use the prenominal use. Speakers do, in fact, avoid using afraid and asleep before nouns. In the novel adjectives, we also found a dispreference. So here we see the generalization at work. Speakers do also avoid using nonsense adjectives like ablim and effect prenominally. But if you're watching the y-axis, you might notice that there's a difference in the degree of dispreference. And in fact, there is an interaction. So here's the data together. There's a stronger dispreference for real adjectives than there is for the nonsense adjectives. And you already know why that might be, right? So, because the nonsense adjectives, you don't know if they're segmentable. And you also haven't heard them preempted. So you have no way to know if they fall in the class of adjectives or not. You see the dispreference, but it's not as strong. That's really actually what you'd expect. Okay. So again, it's unclear whether the novel A adjectives should be viewed as segmentable or not, since they weren't assigned any meaning. And the novel A adjectives weren't preempted also. Okay. So instead of assigning them meaning, that would be the next thing to do. Okay, sorry, this is the generalization. So for real adjectives, they've been statistically preempted by the predicative use. So we've heard the boy was afraid instead of the afraid boy. And we've also categorized the pattern. But in the case of nonsense A adjectives, we just have the categorization, and we're not even sure if the categorization should apply. Okay, so we did a second study where we introduced a preemptive context for the novel A adjectives. Okay? So what we did was we gave people what we called practice trials, but it was really an exposure to a preemptive context. We had people witness two of the 4 novel A adjectives in the second experiment. And they were used in relative clause position. So now we said the cow that was a feck moved to the star in the practice trials for 2 of the novel A adjectives. Then in the test block, there were 16 critical trials interleaved with 16 fillers. What we cared about was how they produced 2 novel A adjectives seen during exposure and 2 novel non-A adjectives. Again, to encourage variability, we used fillers that were biased toward either the prenominal or the predicative use. Okay, so it was like what we did before, except that we introduced this slight amount of preemption. Okay, remember, this is what we found for the first experiment, that the blue bar for nonsense is higher than the blue bar for real, meaning that there was more dispreference for the real A adjectives. With the preemptive context, this is what we get. So we replicate the main effect of phonology. Again, people disprefer A adjectives, whether real or nonsense. But what was striking was that there's no significant difference between the novel A adjectives, which were produced prenominally at the rate of 24%, versus real adjectives. So there's a difference, but it's not statistically significant. There was also no difference between the novel A adjectives that were seen during exposure and the novel A adjectives that weren't. That is, we only gave them the preemptive context for 2 of these made-up A adjectives, but they generalized the property to all of the nonsense A adjectives. And there was no significant difference between those 2. So it looks like they took the preemptive context to mean these nonsense cases are in the class, and then they treated them all as being in the class. Okay, so to conclude, what you see from this little microcosm case is that it's clear we retain a surprising amount of item-specific knowledge. We're keeping track of which adjectives occur in which position. This particular generalization doesn't really have a synchronic semantic explanation. You really have to appeal to the diachrony. That's not usually my style, but there it is. And what's also striking is that we intelligently generalize over item-specific facts. So the generalization is about a plus root. And you can see that generalization at work, both in the case of afraid, which is our real language, and in the case of how you treat the novel A adjectives. I should have added that you also see preemption at work, right? That a little bit of preemption tips people off as to how to treat their language. So thanks go to my postdoc, Jeremy Boyd, and to 2 students, Erica and Christina, who ran a lot of the subjects. Thank you. Yep, Mira.
I like it very much. I was surprised that you didn't mention, you showed the slide with the first one with the very different forms. Aghast was quite different.
Yeah.
16%.
Oh, you're good. Yeah. Okay, so aghast, Okay, so I left it on to be vertical with how the experiment was designed. But it turns out that if you look at the data from the experiment, agast is actually treated differently. It's used prenominally slightly more than the others all tip toward predicative use, and agast doesn't. And so we went back and redid the corpus search. And so actually I had a student do it on a parsed corpus. And it looks like there is no a adjective. That agast is in the wrong, I put it in the wrong category. Okay, so I want to be sure, because when you do the Google searches, again and again, I come up with this same thing. What we need to do now is a norming study, where we ask people, do you recognize this root? Is it meaningful? Gast, you can see, is gast a root? Well, we do have ghastly, but I'm not sure. I mean, it's not as clear a root as live or wake and some of the others.
But the funny thing, looking at that first line, you could say, well, agast was the weakest in terms of your principles. It didn't have the root, and it didn't have the diachronic, motivation, right?
True.
And so it was
True.
the weakest, and so
it's getting sucked into the other.
Statistics being transmitted forever and ever. That's pretty amazing, actually. It would be
Well, exactly. I mean, it would be the exception of the exception that proves the point. It's not right. It doesn't go against the general story, but that's right. I mean, what we would like to see is whether there's actually a correlation with the degree of roothood and the degree of dispreference, and that we haven't done yet. And then we expect agast to fall midway, probably.
But if you're making that analysis for agast, then how does afraid fit the story? Because it's not a very good root either.
Well, neither are the nonsense A adjectives.
But with afraid, you know that it got pulled into the class, so something's got to be done.
Oh. Well, right. So it's a question: is frayed considered a root? We're used to vowel changes, so frayed and frightened might be considered more root-like than gast, but we don't know. Or maybe it's because it's more frequent. I mean, there may be other factors. It may be that it's more frequent, so you've had more instances of preemptive contexts.
But in that case, the real question is, how close did you look at the historical data? Did you actually look at instances, and did afraid drop out of the attributed uses when it got moved into the class?
Oh no, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know that I could get that kind of data to see when afraid stopped being used before nouns. Yeah. Michael.
So in your experiment with these nonsense words, were they only in print? You didn't hear them?
That's right.
So do you think there would be an effect if you had a spoken version present at the same time? So you see the affect box or the affect box. If you manipulated the stress.
Yeah, you'd completely expect that. Right. We just threw out the data when people mispronounced it. So we were checking to see whether they pronounced it as affect, and we only used data when they did. So a few subjects had to be thrown out because they did say affect, and I don't know how they produced the sentences, but you're right. We'd expect no effect there. Yeah, in the back.
I'm wondering the effect of literacy and the effect of what age kids learn these words, because some of the structural properties of the words would be the deep influence, if not determined by spelling and so on. Not that English spelling is such a great guide to pronunciation, but
You're right. That might have an effect. I'm interested in what age kids develop it. I would expect that they wouldn't develop it immediately, and because you have to see the preemptive contexts enough, and this is a subtle enough fact that you don't expect them to get it immediately. And in fact, I mean, this little toy data, but I have an 8-year-old who's really very good with language, and he's always asking me, give me a linguistics question. So I'll ask him, can you say I pushed him the box? And I'm not sure. I mean, his judgments really correspond to adult linguists most of the time. But I asked him, do you like The Afraid Man? He said, yeah, it's fine. And his 11-year-old sister said, no, I wouldn't say that. So I don't know. We have to do it systematically.
And the other thing was, a lot of the adjectives that were working with the unstressed schwa at the beginning were participles, either perfected participles or imperfected participles. I think the only one that wasn't was sleepy. And
You're talking about the semantically matched ones.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. And so if the generalization is based on, you've got this and then you've got a root, certainly participles would be fitting that, except you've also got something else on the end, you've got a suffix. So the generalization, I think, might need to be modified to rule out cases of plus a root plus a participial suffix, like amusing, for example. The person said, I'm amusing to
Good point. Yeah, that's a good point. Amusing, muse. Is muse a root? Muse, amuse. We toyed with saying the restriction was on 2-syllable A adjectives. I actually have a slide on that. So here are some 3-syllable A adjectives, and they systematically allow prenominal use, right? They prefer it, in fact. But then there's a glitter, where you can see that a glitter fits the category because glitter is clearly a root. It doesn't matter that it's 2-syllable. I take your point. I mean, you're talking about additional inflectional morphology, and it's possible that plays a role too. Yeah.
A glitter goes with a glow and things like that semantically too. Must fit.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I was wondering if you thought about doing another nonsense experiment where you try to promote roothood.
Yeah, that would be right. Yeah, we would like to give them meanings and, yeah. Yeah. And then we would expect maybe they wouldn't need the preemptive context. So there are different ways to get into the category.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Yes?
You mentioned just a moment ago things being clearly a root, and one of the things that would seem to make something clearly a root is the frequency with which it occurs outside of the adjective. So sleep, living, presumably very frequent, whereas ghastly, I don't know, but it would be interesting to
Right.
compare how frequent is ghastly, and that might make a difference.
Yeah, you're right. Although, glitter's not all that high frequency, and yet it's clearly in the category.
It's probably more frequent than ugly, I mean, compared frequency of the form and the other form.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh. Right, so that the form looks derived from the root. That's a good point. Mm-hmm. Not syntactically, but yes. Right. Mm-hmm. Yes?
One of the things I've noticed about undergraduate writers is that they often are missing, they know what words mean, but they don't understand the nuances and how to use them, especially words that more frequently appear in print, like noodle or complementary.
Yeah.
And I often will tell them, you have to read a lot to become a good writer, but it's that exposure, to the nuances of how constructions are used, not just breaking it down to what they actually mean. And I guess I'm sort of finding some support for that idea. It's always just been something that I've said, but finding some support for that idea from your study that there's this process of preemption that it's really hard to articulate where that comes from. It's just from,
You need a lot of exposure. Yeah.
Would you allow me to make that conclusion out of this?
Yeah, I mean, that's clearly true. I mean, we know that we use a fraction of the words and constructions we know in our spoken speech. So to become a good writer, you have to read because you're not going to hear them, those words and constructions, right? Normal people don't say, perhaps even, right? I mean, some of you do, I know, but but it's not a word you hear a lot, but you read it, right? So even simple words, you need to read. And for these cases, that might well be true. That goes back to your question, right? That it might have to, you might only acquire these kind of very subtle things by massive reading. It's possible. Maybe if you live long enough. They're not particularly low frequency words. Alive, afraid. Yes?
Just to comment on that, I didn't study this especially my students about right, but that's the intersection between frequency and literacy is how frequent literate contact, how frequent speech contact. I don't think you can separate those two. The many a night example that you gave is a highly literate one.
Yeah.
And we've got that you can have a lot of audiences,
Yeah, you're right. I think that's right. And it's partly, I mean, in that case, it might be a construction that's on its way out, so.
Or on its way in this thing.
Right. Right.
Any further questions?
In the earlier work, did you look at the relation between many a night he passed thinking about the future and many a night was spent thinking about the future? In other words, is there some relation?
Yeah, we're just beginning to work on that, on this particular construction. So no, we've only looked at we started out with an interest in subject auxiliary inversion. So that's how we got interested in many a night. But to do a full analysis of many a night, you'd want to look at it in other contexts too, where you don't have the subject, yeah. Yeah.
I'd like to ask a general question about where you think this research program may be heading. And I want to ask the question in a different way. So some computational linguists are fond of saying that, well, if you want to account for the distribution or the usage pattern of definite and indefinite articles in English, the best account that there is so far is just purely statistical. Now, what you've been doing is really masterful in being able to piece together a combination of various principles like exceptions to exceptions with statistics. And you've mentioned, although briefly in this discussion, an interest in say finding different ways or how strong these various principles are. What seems to be arising out of this is a really wonderful account of a combination of principles and statistics and their relative weightings down to as fine a grain a level if you can. But so where do you see this going? Is it possible, for example, to have a complete account? I mean, account for every item that's used in the language, and to what degree do you think this program could offer that?
We're looking at all the adjectives. This is a longer set. What the thing that interests me most about this work is the generalization part. So a lot of usage-based theorists, a lot of functional linguists have emphasized our item-specific knowledge. And that is clearly a fact. In response to the generative syntacticians, it's an important point to make, because they only see general, elegant rules. But what I find so fascinating about language is our tendency to generalize. So statistics can give you the generalization, but you need a model that accounts for that. You don't just want to model each individual case as a separate case. You would never account for the novel cases, for the behavior of the novel cases if you did that.
No, that's true, but I think one of the more vexing problems you're addressed is knowing something about diachronic usage and historical usage, and then being able to measure some persistence of patterns, but that pattern gets transformed and interacts with contemporaneous rules or contemporaneous principles, and so that's you've got several dimensions of patterns that are interactive. You're trying to sort that out. To what degree do you think it's possible?
Right, I think it is possible. I mean, this is kind of a nice case for a modeler to use, where you say, here's the input statistics now, and you might even be able to model the historical part where at first they're prepositional phrases, they pattern like prepositional phrases, then they don't, but still this part remains, and you get preemption, you get you'd have to feed in the segmentability aspect. I think it could be modeled. I'm not a modeler myself, but I don't see why not. It seems the principles are pretty clear. Yeah.
I have a question about who hits this 129,667. Did you or your assistants try clicking through to the end of this?
Of course not.
No. I mean, I have, and what usually happens is about 200 or 300. All of a sudden it says, well, we've given you.
And as many as you're going to get.
No,
right.
no, it's not that.
What?
It's that that large number includes double, triple, quadruple, n-tuple countings of the same passage. And you don't find that out until you click through to the end, and suddenly the number is much lower. So this number 48 is probably a true number, but 29,667 may not be.
Well, you're absolutely right, and you have to take the Google hits with a grain of salt. You also because I'm choosing the nouns, and maybe it's different with the next noun.
Oh,
right?
so you're doing the whole phrase.
I'm doing the adjacent store.
Okay.
The store was adjacent. Right. Right. But I think that it's useful because it's just so overwhelmingly skewed. These are not subtle facts. These are just. But you're right. I mean, there certainly are replications. There certainly are productions from non-native speakers. There are all kinds of problems with Google. But if you're dealing with really large numbers, it may not matter because there should be repetitions in both categories. But you're getting a skewing. And all we wanted to point out was the skewing. And the experimental data backs this up.
Just a note following up on that, for these particular sorts of phrases, you can probably get numbers that are similar, but without those problems from using the Google Ngrams instead of Google search.
Okay, you have to show me how to do that.
Well, yeah, you have to have them.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I don't know how to do that. Okay. Thank you.